welcome Daniel Yezbick, professor of comics and adaptation and rhetoric and composition, all things sort of important in our lives there at St. Louis Community College in Wildwood. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So we're going to talk about comics and humor and action figures and animal studies, all of the things that are sort of exciting and
everything that matters in the world. Very exciting.
everything. But let's start with this maybe kind of at the
dear.
very beginning with your
Yes.
Perfect Nonsense. Tell us all about this project. Yeah.
Oh, I sometimes you look back on things you've done and you think, oh, I can't believe that turned out that way, or I can't believe this happened or that happened. Perfect Nonsense is the absolute top example of looking back and just thinking, wow, there were so many things that had to happen for this project to occur. And everything, even though it took a long time, took about 10 years, it still all fell out in ways that I could not have possibly imagined. So for people who are very, very into comics history, they've known the name George Carlson for quite a while. Harlan Ellison wrote his famous essay, Comic of the Absurd, in All in Color for a Dime. There's a good 20 pages of Carlson in the first Smithsonian book of comic book comics. And I got that book as a child for Christmas. And I knew a lot of the things in it. I knew the Carl Barks stories. I knew Will Eisner. I of course love them. But there was this crazy, bizarre, psychedelic thing in the back that I'd never heard of before. And as a kid, I was a little offended that I had not been exposed to this cool stuff earlier. And those were Carlson's Jingle Jangle Tales and Pie-Face Prince stories, and it sort of stuck with me all those years. And the more I dug, because I was a comics fan and a collector and everything else as a teenager, you couldn't find Carlson anywhere, and it just sort of stuck in my mind. So when I got to college and grad school, when I had access to archives and things, I started researching him and discovered that he was actually a children's illustrator and a poet. And here's something that no one has ever talked about. He was a master of making crossword puzzles. He made millions of crossword puzzles throughout his career for different magazines, and just never really got any attention. And then I wrote a short article for Image Text years ago and thought that would be it. I said, oh, well, I found some things on Carlson. Let's kind of put it together. And then I did a little talk on Carlson at the Image Text conference. And before I was done talking, this sort of frenetic, crazy person came running down the aisle at me and said that they desperately wanted the article for the Image Text Journal. That was Charles Hatfield. And Charles, and I'm very grateful to Charles. He was so excited about the project and he just encouraged it in so many ways. So that turned into another article and a couple of other talks. And before I knew it, I was talking to Fantagraphics about doing a whole book because no one knew anything about this man. And it was fun to dig into the archives and find some other scholars in other fields, scholars in children's literature, scholars in mathematics. Martin Gardner had written a very obscure essay on Carlson, and it was actually Carlson's work in children's pulps that got Gardner into mathematics in the first place, which is really interesting. And I talked to Martin Gardner on the phone, and he wound up sharing all of his Carlson research. And then before I knew it, I was actually talking to the family, the great-grandchildren and grandchildren of the Carlson estate, and we were working together to get this man some attention that he certainly deserved. And it's interesting also that artists like Carlson, who were so unique, so original, almost like outsider artists, except that they were part of the mainstream sort of publishing industry at the time, they just fell through the cracks. They didn't have the personality of Jack Kirby or Stan Lee or Will Eisner. They weren't hustlers. He was a quiet, he was also older than a lot of the other artists. He was just sort of a quiet, old-fashioned artist who would do spot work and publication work, and wasn't really good at self-promotion like some of the big newspaper and comic book cartoonists were. So he just kind of got ignored. And a lot of the times he wouldn't even sign his name on things. He'd do their names. So luckily the family had a list. A couple of other collectors had lists of things that he'd done. I hunted down a few more. And we put together what Gary Groth was really excited about, thinking this was going to be a huge hit, this fabulous book that everyone was going to want to get a hold of. And according to Gary, it's one of the worst-selling Fantagraphics books ever. Not because of the content, but because it just didn't. The Carlson name just isn't as well known. We had plans for a sequel. The sequel has not happened, but thank God for Fantagraphics. They put everything into it. I gave the wonderful designer some ideas for the cover, and he was a huge Carlson fan and went to town on it. As you know, the book has a die-cut cover, which is very expensive. They had complete faith in it. The book won a design award for one of the best 500 book designs of that year worldwide. So it toured the world. And it gave a lot of people some exposure to Carlson and filled in the story. No one knew anything about him. There were Harlan Ellison had theories that he was a radical sort of proto hippie. This is not true. He was a quiet little conservative man with an incredible imagination, very much like Lewis Carroll, who was also his idol. Carlson had two daughters who he named Dorothy and Alice for obvious reasons. So he always lived in these children's fantasy worlds, and I think we did a pretty good job with it, considering all the things that happened to get it together. We still have lots more Carlson to share with the world. My favorite two parts of the book are the beautifully restored 50, 60 pages of Jingle Jangle Tales and Pie-Face Prince stories in the back. And then if you look at the cover, you see he had a little spot drawing for a children's textbook about numbers that he did. It was he just filled in the drawings, but I fell in love with this little drawing of this squirrel making cookies. I just thought it was such a fun little image. So I mentioned that to the designer, and he put it right on the front cover so everyone can finally appreciate this little squirrel. So I think that's kind of nice. So that's probably too much, but there you go.
Oh, I love that. And also it sort of reminds people that deep diving in the archives isn't just about folios and Shakespeare.
That's right. Yeah. Now I should throw this in too. The Carlson estate, the papers, all of Carlson's art, Carlson's copies of things, Carlson's personal notebooks, all of that went to a grandson in Chicago who died suddenly. And when we heard about that, and I kept trying to get a hold of his widow, but of course she was in a transitional period. No one knew what happened to this stuff. And then the next thing we knew, we heard that the apartment was empty and all kinds of things had gone wrong. So I thought this book was never going to happen. And then a friend of mine called and said his friend has the estate. Get over there as soon as you can. So I wound up driving across the country to an art dealer's house, and we went through the estate. I explained a lot of it, and he explained a lot of it, and some of it had already been sold, but we wound up getting the bulk of it to go to Washington University's Modern Graphic History Library. So we managed to keep the bulk of the estate together, which I think is, and there's a wonderful online index to Carlson's work that WashU has put up, and the incredible curator there, Sky Lacerte, has done a fabulous job sort of indexing his work. So you're right, there's a lot of it in the archive that we can still play with.
Incredible story. And actually, sometimes, as you know, Daniel, these things that we do, and especially, on kind of the significance of a shaping sort of figure like George Carlson,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it takes maybe another generation, our graduate students, or even our undergraduate, right?
Yes.
But the fact is, it's out there, and you did it, and it's important, it's significant, and it brings him to the kind of into the, not just the scholarly world, but also the kind of cultural studies space, right?
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate that. Thank you. I've had nothing but very positive comments about the book from fans, from scholars, from absolutely everybody. So I've been very pleased with how it turned out. It's probably time to do something else with Carlson.
Animals, Carlson, you and your work, your worldview, you're also just a really sort of joyful person. Let me ask you, like political humor, and comics and cartoons is also an important part of your life. And why is that? And what are some takeaways?
Boy, that's an open question, but I appreciate it. I'm going to give you a two-part answer, if that's okay. First of all, I think you and I agree that one of the greatest things about comics is that comics deal with whether it's directly or indirectly, comics deal with the problems of the world, right? They are something that's very immediate. It doesn't matter what the genre is, whether it's crime or superheroes or Los Brothers Hernandez, whatever it is, it's responding to issues and problems that we're dealing with right now, and it does it in a way that's a little different from journalism, a little different from cinema, a little different from broadcasting. It's multimodal. It's very intimate. It makes comments about the world around us in ways that I think I really believe that all comics in one way or another are trying to make the world a little bit better and trying to make us really aware of our flaws. And sometimes that really, really hurts with things like Mouse. Sometimes it's just an escapist Sunday Marmaduke strip. But whatever it is, the comics medium seems to be reaching out to us to get us to appreciate words and pictures and what they can say about the world around us. So that's one of the reasons why I like working with comics and politics. The more historical part of that is I was very fortunate when I was doing my graduate work to be living in the same town as R.C. Harvey, and Bob Harvey and I. Bob Harvey is a very important comics historian and journalist. He and I he just came to my class once to talk, and then after that we had lunch, and then we had another lunch, and then we started having lunch twice a week, and then we were at each other's houses a lot. So Bob is a good and close dear friend, and Bob, of course, is probably the world's expert on Milton Caniff, and he had produced a 80,000 page treatise on Milton Caniff, the ultimate biography that Caniff had actually approved of in his lifetime, but it was too big to publish. So one of the last things I did before I left Champaign for my first job teaching was Bob and I worked out a plan where I would help edit his biography of Milton Caniff, which is called Meanwhile, which Fantagraphics also put out, and OSU actually helped sponsor that since Caniff is an OSU grad. So I spent a good 2 years. It took Bob 10 years to write it. It took me 2 years to cut it. And if you've seen the book, it's still a doorstop. It can do a lot of damage, but it was great fun to work on, and that really got me into that inner world of classic illustrators and cartoonists of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Bob had done such an incredible, scrupulous job of all the context there. So I got into Milton Caniff's story. I got into Al Cap's story. I got into all these characters and the worlds they created, Little Orphan Annie and the politics there, and Gasoline Alley and the politics there, and Crazy Cat and the artistic politics there. So that's where I started diving deeply into that. And the more I worked on it, the more I realized, boy, Milton Caniff is really an incredible human being, and Al Cap is not. I guess I wrote a small piece on Al Cap that caught people's attention because I hate to say this because, like you say, I try to be positive. I don't know of a more despicable human being than Al Cap in many ways. An incredible artist, a wonderful satirist, and people keep asking me to write more on Al Cap, and it's hard because he had such a difficult, complicated life. He had such an angry, vehemently virulent worldview, but his characters are compelling and his ideas are compelling. So it's fun to mix those two together. So I guess that's, again, a long answer.
There's something with your students, with people in general, that humor or laughter that kind of can and maybe opens them to seeing things that they might not be open to otherwise.
Definitely. Yeah, no, and there's and sometimes it's the humor. So one of the great things about Al Cap's little Abner, as you can see here, is, I mean, you can just glance at it and there's 5 or 6 different sexual puns going on that people can play with. It's a standard Appalachian family dinner, but there's also a big ham hock there. We're sort of looking at Daisy May's ham hocks. Little Abner is constantly a sex symbol as well. There's the little talking sausage down in the corner. He's always filling in stuff that's funny for kids and also funny for adults. And there, you're right, we can find common ground in sort of the earthiness of it, I guess. The other thing is the absence of humor. So Milton Caniff's Terry and the Pirates, some of those, one particular strip from Terry and the Pirates was the first comic strip to be read into the Congressional Record because he stopped the drama and he stopped the action and he told a story about the American military and how much they sacrifice every day. And Caniff's famous Terry and the Pirates holiday Christmas strips were always very important to that, and the famous World War II Sunday page where Terry goes off to fight to fight the Japanese. These are moments where you're expecting escapism, humor, fantasy, whatever it might be, and you get something very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So censorship in comics as well, that's an area that you've been investigating. And of course, there's a whole long history of,
Oh
race,
yes.
being censored. Tell us a little bit about your work there.
Well, again, I've been very fortunate with people who have invited me into their projects. So John Jennings, of course, is one of my great closest friends, and he and Damian Duffy had originally worked on this anthology. Damian backed out to do other things, or just didn't back out. He just went to do other projects. And Francis Gateward, who is married to David Desser, who was on my dissertation committee, so we had connections as well. I'd taught with Francis for years, U of I, so John and I met there as well. So they wanted to do something that was obviously very, very needed, a close focused anthology on African American comics or Pan-African comics or blackness in comics, really. And I said, well, there's this great EC story. And again, I think one of the things that I can do is, like with the Carlson book, like with Cap and Kniff, is to find the little edges and corners that sometimes people might miss. So Judgment Day, of course, is a famous story. Gaines called it maybe the best story they ever published, largely out of self-promotion. But it was a story that was almost censored, and what intrigued me was the stupidity of the censoring. Like sometimes we censor things because they're too explicit or they're too politically volatile. They wanted to censor the last panel. They wanted to take the tears off of the African American's face. I'm sorry, off the African's face, and that was just absurd. And even Gaines said that was absurd. And that was, so the idea of no sweat, we're going to take the sweat off of this black man's face, because the idea of a black man sweating in space is somehow offensive. That's a really interesting way of looking at the cultural crises of the 1950s. So that was what spawned the essay, and I think it turned out fairly well.
Well, The Blacker the Ink went on to win an Eisner.
Yes.
Yeah, and of course that is the curating, and then of course the careful curating of excellent work like yourself. It's interesting that you talked about going to the kind of the edges of the archives, and kind of in a way your interest as a PhD student in early
Yeah.
literature is right there, right? Yeah.
Right. Some of this, and I think you'll agree with this too. I mean, for us to do what we do, I think a part of it has to be we just love being. We love finding old things, right? There's that great line from Shakespearean Negotiations. I begin with a desire to speak with the dead, right? And that's kind of what we do. We want to find these old worlds and that are still with us in so many ways, but the actual materials. I often laugh when I talk to people who love comics, and they truly love comics. They love the medium. They love the narrative diversity, but they've never actually held a comic book. They've held a graphic novel. They've read everything on Comixology, which is great. I think that's just fine. That's their comics. My comics are things that are, torn up with a staple missing, that we flip through and we find little hidden truths that we may have missed. Now that could be all dressed up and revised in Comixology, but for well over 100 years, right? It's been pieces of paper stapled together, and I think it's important to at least remember that at some level.
Yeah, the materiality. So
yeah.
Animal studies. Animal studies, speaking of scholarship, that's like a really booming kind of space. But you're bringing that together with comics, and of course it makes sense, right? But you do something like not only kind of a kind of sort of history, but you kind of, you reveal to us things that are, it's not just animals or anthropomorphic kind of characterizations, right? There's something else going on. What is that? Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. First of all, we were talking about this earlier. There's that point where you've kind of done what you did in grad school, you've taught what you did in grad school, and you start looking around for other things. And for me, that thing is the incredibly rich and interdisciplinary world of animal studies, and I've always loved nature. I spent a lot of my life in northern Michigan. I've always been very eco-conscious and very environmentally conscious, which is hard when you study things made of paper and plastic. It becomes a personal sort of paradox or hypocrisy. But when I started reading more and more about the Anthropocene and about the enormous global crises that we will be facing in 10 to 15 years, if we aren't already facing them now, for me, I just had to find a way to find a way to make the things that I love somehow relevant to that. And I thought, well, one of the ways that we can help understand what's going on with our climate and with the world around us is through the way that we learn about animals, the way that we make art about animals, the way that we appreciate animals. So that's where the animal studies and the animal art first came from. And the more I read and the more I dug, the more I started to love it. So that's not only because it's fun and because it's incredibly complicated, but also because I think it's so urgent. It's so necessary right now. In comic studies, I think it's really necessary because I really believe that the single most influential theme in comics is the talking animal. And that's especially, someone might say, well, it's the superhero. Well, half the superheroes are animals, right? Spider-Man, Batman, Catman, Animal Man, Swamp Thing isn't really an animal, it's vegetable, but it's still very, very sort of eco-conscious. So if we take all of the animal metaphors that we have in the superhero world, Wolverine, right? And start mixing them into Uncle Scrooge and Crazy Cat and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, we see that really comics have been telling animal stories from the very, very beginning. And I was very, very flattered that David Herman contacted me to see if I would do a piece on the history of animal comics. And I owe David a lot because he really put up with a lot. I have never had an essay so late in my life. We had a lot of personal things going on. We had grandparents who were sick. We had car accidents. So whatever, you don't need to know about that. But he was, that man is the most patient man I've ever known. And he was very pleased with the final product, I think. And it was great fun tracing the themes of animal humor, of anthropomorphic humor, through different phases and through different genres. The talking animal, the pet strip, the sort of angry animals of the underground and the black and white boom, and then again looking at sort of humanoid animals, looking at super animals. There's just so many places we can go. I am still hoping to put together a book dealing with totally with animal comics. It is my next project if I ever get the chance. So
I can't wait for that. And of
oh,
course,
well, that's very kind.
well, of course, we know that even Stan Lee talks about, and I call this the geometrizing of the narrative or the character. But of course, behind all of this, his concepts of the superhero, you have the shapes of the animals, right? So the lion,
yes,
and the
yes.
yeah. Anyway, it's there. It's all pervasive. We can't wait for your book. Let
Oh,
me.
well, that's kind.
Yeah. So yeah, but then there's also really very contemporary spaces, right? Sci-fi, speculative spaces, where you have
Right.
this kind of cross-species kind of empathy that's becoming a very central part of the narrative. Maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Sure. And first of all, you sure picked the three right examples here. This is absolutely perfect. So we've got Red Dog, we've got Animosity, and we've got Legend. And one of the trends that I'm most interested in is what's happening right now. There's really three themes here. There's the animal-human balance, the relationship, the pet partner kind of thing, or is what some people call the companion animal. So you see in two of the three cases, you've got people, humans, children paired with animals. You've also got a running theme of cybernetics and robotics dealing with the stuff that Donna Haraway talks about. That we're kind of culturally replacing legitimate animal experience not only with pets and zoos, but with um, with artificial intelligence, with cybernetics, with robotics. So the Red Dog isn't even really a dog; it's sort of a dog thing. Same thing happening throughout Animosity. And then the third theme that's in all three is this idea of both exploration and apocalypse, the two kind of combined. There's a lot of anger now between the natural animal world and the human artificial world, and the new dystopic hybrid visions are that they seem to speak to us in interesting ways. That's what creators are interested in. That's what current comics consumers are sort of fascinated by. I mean, the very title of the book, Animosity, tells us that this is where these are, of course, exaggerated nightmare stories, but these are the things that prey heavily on our minds. Legend, and I'm really glad you have it there, is I'm surprised there hasn't been more of that particular series, but there are many others. There's plague dogs, there's squarriors, there's all kinds of stories about, well, there's still that animal human interaction going on, but there are new threats and new worries, and maybe the worst worry is what happens when human civilization collapses. What do the animals do then? So that's really a whole separate book in itself, because there's so many of these stories coming up now. There's Autumn Lands, there's the new sort of darker versions of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which I have not read that much of, but it's not as playful as it once was. And Animosity is sort of split into several different series now as well. So.
Yeah, so of course, not just entertainment, but kind of expressing some of our anxieties, but also maybe, hey, if we kind of do certain things today, maybe we won't be in a situation, this dystopia tomorrow, right?
Right. Well, and again, here's comics asking us to learn, asking us to make things better, asking us to change. As we sit here looking at 3 dystopic animal stories in the middle of a pandemic that's locked us all down with our pets, there's a lot of that going on. I mean, there was a great joke going around the internet recently. It's like, nations' dogs love whatever the heck's going on in the world, right? Because their people are home all the time. And then there's all these, I'm on a couple sort of eco-environmentalists, and they're all saying, like, animals are showing up where animals have not been for years, because the people have kind of pulled back and retreated and retrenched a bit. And just last night, my wife woke us up because 2 owls were on our roof, and we've never heard them because of the city noise and the traffic and whatever's going on. But we got to listen to owls all night long, which is something that, I mean, this is a terrible thing, this pandemic, there's no doubt about it, but it's interesting to see how nature sort of pulls back or comes back. And these stories all speak to that kind of thing.
Action figures, action heroes. Yeah, with Jonathan, you guys have had a lot of fun.
Yes. Yes, I cannot take full credit for this material, but I will say my good friend and co-author Jonathan Alexandratos is probably the greatest scholar of American toys working right now. He's also an incredible playwright. He's also an incredible teacher, and he and I started talking more and more at the wonderful Page 23 conference in Denver every year, and discovered that we both had a fondness for what toys do culturally. And we started working on some things together. You were very supportive when we sort of shocked the room at OSU a few years ago with bringing all our toys into the room, having people play with it. But the more we started talking about it, the more mature ideas got. And we decided, again, if comics are there to help us fix things or help make us more aware of things, whether we're laughing or worrying about it, toys do the same thing. Toys and material culture, so much of who we are has to do with the things that we hold when we're young, and the way that we play with them, and the way that we discover with them and what they are. We certainly saw that. The greatest example recently is the wave of incredibly empowering Black Panther and Captain Marvel toys that came out in recent years for African American children to play with positive representations of themselves. Not that we didn't have that before in other places, but we certainly have it there. And for very, very empowered alpha girls to find their world through Captain Marvel. So important. But it goes farther back than that. Jonathan and I have been working on it for years now, and the more we dig, the more interesting it gets. So the action figure for us is the action figure is the great toy of the 20th century. There's no question. It's part doll. It's part sort of fetish object, especially the way that adults collect them. Right? It's not just a toy for them, it's more of an ornament. It's a statement about their mythologies, about their taste, about their affluence, and because it's posable and movable, and because many of them have costumes that we can change, it's all about transformation. It's all about identity discovery. It's all about gender identification. So we've had a lot of fun finding these really important seminal toys and talking about what they have done culturally. Also, like comics, toys and action figures, even though they are very important to material culture, they also are part of one of the nastiest, most difficult, and competitive American industries that there are. Most toy CEOs have had some pretty complicated legal concerns. So, and the battle between Barbie and GI Joe, the strange licensing that went on with Mego, all the variants, Kenner's Star Wars toys sold so well, and George Lucas had such a bad deal on them that he actually held up making the rest of the movies until that contract was over. So
I didn't
yeah, so it gets even weirder than that. But yeah, so everyone was waiting for those for those next 3 films, but he didn't want to do it until he could get a better deal on his percentage for the toys. Also, as we all know, or as often known, Han Solo was supposed to die in the films, but his action figure in the Millennium Falcon sold so well that they kept him alive. So there's an example of a toy actually changing the narrative of a multi-million-dollar media franchise. And then the other things we've got here, the other thing I love about the more you read into these histories of toys is you find these heroes, very much like George Carlson or Milton Caniff. You find people like Charlotte Clark, who had a unique contract with Walt Disney Studios. She actually got her name on her very special dolls. They built her a house on the Disney lot for her to manufacture her dolls. If you know how Disney works, you know how rare it is to get any credit whatsoever. So this is a woman in the 1930s, actually dictating the rules of how these dolls are going to be made to Walt Disney and his brother. That's unheard of. You get things like the Mego Falcon doll, which we're pretty sure, we haven't confirmed it completely, but we're pretty sure that's the first ever African American action figure. Probably so. And it was done, Mego did it because no one had done one yet. I don't think they had any great cultural interests. They weren't trying to make a political statement. They wanted to sell toys. But that Falcon doll, I grew up in a largely African American neighborhood, and of course I had Batman and Spider-Man and such, and the Green Goblin, but all my friends had the Falcon because they being black, that was the character they wanted. And whenever we played in the street or at each other's houses, they'd bring their Falcons with them because that's the one that meant something to them. So there's a lot of personal stories, a lot of cultural stories. There's just a lot to say about how toys function.
Yeah, I had no idea about even the Han Solo. Thanks for sharing that. I want to show you something.
Sure.
So, speaking of Jonathan, he gifted this, and of course, we also have our Latina superheroes.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, so
that's great.
I'm totally with you guys. There's something. It's beyond just being kind of nostalgic and the sort of fetishistic aspect. There's something like you were just telling us in this sort of brief version, important about the material history of their sort of making and presence and transforming within the culture that we live in.
Mm-hmm. It's actually, it's funny you mention, it's really hard to trace because Jonathan and I have been working on it, trying to trace what the first Latin action figure really is. It's probably some awful Western stereotype from the 50s, but maybe one of the first one that really gets a lot of attention is Chips, right? Eric Estrada's Chips.
And oh yeah. So do you think? Well, hold on. El Dorado, weren't those around the same time? The
could be.
Yeah. I think El Dorado might even come just a little bit. But I remember both, and I had both.
Okay. Great.
along with, Bionic Man and all that other stuff.
Right.
But so, in a nutshell, Daniel, you are a beloved teacher. All of that stuff. But why should we teach this? Why should we bring this into our classrooms?
um, well, the why I think the honest answer to that, and I think you'll probably agree with me, is I couldn't help doing it, right? I don't think you could help doing it, right? We bring the things we love to our classes, and we find, but I also love it when I can show students something they didn't know they cared about.
Mm.
So when I have students, and I know Jonathan does this too, when I have students write about a toy that meant something to them as a child, at first they think, oh, this is kid stuff, I'm in college, why am I writing about a Barbie doll or a Raggedy Ann or the Cat in the Hat? But I would say almost always when they're done writing, they come up and they say, I actually enjoyed this essay. There were things that I remembered that I had forgotten. Or they'll talk about, they start writing about a doll their grandmother gave them, but the essay changes into remembering the song she used to sing them when she was a little girl. So there are keeping students off kilter, teaching them about texts that have unexpected benefits, whether it's a comic strip or a toy or a doll, really allows them to dig deeper and more richly into their own memory and maybe become a little more tolerant and aware of other people's experiences as well. So why comics? Because comics saved me. Comics gave me a world to think about when I was young and didn't really have the best prospects. Why toys? Because toys are fun, and learning should be fun, and teaching is fun when it works well. And there's so much that has to do with, I think, fun and I think fun and wisdom are very closely connected, and the more I can show students how to do that, the better off I think we all are.
Can't wait to have the opportunity one of these days to sit in on one of your classes.
Oh, that's very kind.
I'll do one of those Zoom bombs that I've been reading about.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, we talked about kind of the archive. We've talked about animals and comics. What is exciting for you in comic studies today?
Well, mostly that there is one. That the comic studies is actually here. I mean, and I think we're all part of it. We're all at that vanguard that was sort of fighting for legitimacy, right? I got to tell you a quick story because it's so funny. So when I was in grad school, I got to teach my first ever comics survey. It was English 106, and we called it Biff Boom Pow, the Great American Graphic Novel, or something like that. And the U of I had a contest. You could write in to the administration to ask permission to teach a class, and they accepted the comics class. And and one of the students in that class, by the way, was Damian Duffy, who has now become quite an important creator and scholar himself. So that was great news. But so the class went on the books, and it filled within 48 hours. It was already full, and I was excited because this is 1998, 99, somewhere in there. Comic studies isn't quite legitimized yet. I think it's safe to say. But the U of I's department was incredibly supportive. The students loved it. There was a wait list. I let everybody in. It was a big comics party twice a week. It was a blast. But I was walking down the hallway in the department, and this older professor who I had, who was an excellent teacher, he was a Ben Jonson scholar and known for being very conservative, very soft-spoken, very quiet. He pulled me aside. He leaned over to me and he said, "I just want to let you know that I know about this class you are teaching, and I completely support and endorse what you're doing, even though you will probably bring the Chicago Tribune down on our heads." And then he shuffled away, and I was always very proud that even he was like, yeah, this will be a good thing, I think. So it's great that we now have comic studies. It's great that we have comic studies degrees and programs, and I'm meeting grad students who have spent the last 4 or 5 years studying comics. This is this is glorious time. Our field is growing in so many ways. It's growing in the archive. It's growing in the media adaptations. It's growing in terms of international comics and manga and bande dessinée and all kinds of things. So, and it's great that we now have these forums where we can all sit and talk, students, scholars, fans, teachers, high school teachers, middle school teachers. I had a great conversation the other day. We do these first Fridays at the St. Louis Science Center, and I was on a Blade Runner panel with a middle school science teacher who was looking for ways to integrate cyberpunk and science fiction into his classes. So just to have these forums is just it's a wonderful, exciting time to do what we do. And the amazing thing is people keep letting us do it, really. So it's great. I mean, there's little factions and preferences and things, but I find that all part of the growing pains. It's great fun.
Well, with that, Daniel Yezbick, scholar, teacher, lover of comics. Thank you for joining Professor Latinx.
Thank you, sir. It was great fun. Thanks for having me.